Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the latest issue of State of the Newsroom. The link to the edition will be placed in the chat towards the end of this webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. This issue of State of the Newsroom takes a detailed look at the possible impact of artificial intelligence on the news in South Africa, what's happening now, and the changes newsrooms will need to make. We also ask media experts what they think the future holds for public interest journalism in the country, and look at the donor funding crisis facing media initiatives. With us to discuss some of these issues, we have Sipho Kings, who is the co-founder and publisher of The Continent, and Paul McNally from Develop AI. A very warm welcome to all of you. Paul, I would like to start with you, if possible. You've written what I think is a substantial and very interesting piece on how AI is going to impact the future of journalism. What is your sense of the current status of test driving AI in newsrooms in South Africa at the moment?
Well, yeah, thanks so much. And it was interesting to write it as well. I think South Africa is, it's encouraging how different sectors, and I mean that in terms of like community, in terms of, I guess, mainstream and independent, are tackling it in different ways. Like I've been coaching newsrooms from different parts of that sort of sectors, and in the community space there is strangely some uptake. Like I was working with a newsroom called Ponderland Times that are based in the Eastern Cape, and they are sort of three guys in a room who have been putting out a community newspaper for years, 5,000 people, 5,000 issues, and they wanted to improve their digital strategy. And, they wanted to use AI to do that. And we coached them through that process. They went in all sorts of directions to AI avatars and beyond, and sort of latched onto this idea that we worked through where they took their Google Analytics from their website. This is like a very basic example. And they built a small tool, a small AI tool that basically made sense of their Google Analytics in a way that they hadn't before. And they were able to turn their revenue from, I think, like the equivalent of $10 to $2,000, right, a month, right? So I think there is sort of real potential in that. But then I think buried in that example is the idea that how long will SEO really last, right? We are now seeing the real sort of fallout from the fact that the internet is going to change, and people with that kind of SEO casual traffic are going to get hit, right? And I think that on that macro scale, South African newsrooms are woefully unprepared for that generally. I think that there is a huge issue on that side. So on the experimental side, it's very encouraging. Like I see newsrooms of all shapes and sizes experimenting with things, trying to digitize things. But I think the grander sort of issue that will come in terms of revenue models that rely on Google Ads. I mean, we all lamented Google Ads for a decade at every journalism conference, and now we're going to be looking back at the fond days of Google Ads. And I think that's a problem. And I think we need more openness and talking and just kind of like brainstorming around that issue.
I mean, do you have a sense of the transparency of the AI companies in this process? I mean, I guess there's little engagement with them around the media, or, do you know if any discussions are going on?
Well, I mean, there was I would point to the M20, which I think Sipho was at as well, where we all met in Joburg and talked through like the sort of issues of big tech and sort of information integrity. And Isaac Minna and a whole host of people put together some incredible declarations around what we wanted the sort of G20 to respond to, and as particularly like by extension, what we want from big tech companies and this kind of sense of transparency. But I mean, now that we're a few months after that and the G20, is in flux, then I think we haven't seen the results that we wanted, I think, from that. But not to say that it was a bust. I think it was incredibly successful on certain terms. And I think there is a kind of now momentum, which hopefully will carry to the G20 in when it's in America. But I think, it's good for media. And, there's the Media Viability Manifesto, right? That a whole host of development organizations banded together to build. And I think, it's difficult to talk about media models and things like that, because everyone has their own way and wanting of doing things. But I think the thing that's buried in that, which is good, is this sense that media organizations should take some sort of advocacy role, like think of themselves as activists when it comes to approaching, yes, big tech companies, and kind of building the ecosystem that will allow their business to thrive, rather than the strategy that's always been around, which is just like, we'll just take whatever comes and then we'll react to this. We're going to react to it and take it on the chin. And we're media and we're strong about this. So I think there is, in Johannesburg, there is a concerted group of people that are trying very hard to make these things happen. But it's actually going to take like every media organization to take some sort of responsibility for that part of it.
Yeah, that's very interesting because you do mention issues of a collaboration that's necessary around cross-border collaboration, particularly among small publishers. But here you're talking more around the advocacy element. That's interesting. I mean, in your article talking about the sort of future ecosystem, you say that, and this is quoting, trust will be the linchpin of the future consumer experience in the context of a radically transformed way of consuming news. How do you see public interest journalism surviving in this world where artificial intelligence is likely to shape the information we consume and how we consume it?
Well, I think like what survive, and I don't mean this in a negative sense of just surviving in that you're just like, that kind of feels like you're a lesser version of yourself. But I think the idea of what surviving looks like for some media organizations is going to have to change, and that includes, the kinds of people that sort of want to be journalists. I think that's also kind of a tough thing for people to think about, in that I'm a strong advocate for the idea that a newsroom is going to change, right? All businesses are going to change because of AI, and we want to automate it, or not we want to, but certain things are going to automate, and you need to upskill the people that are there so their job doesn't slowly automate and then you fire them, right? Like, obviously, I am a strong candidate for that. But I think there is also an aspect where certain people in that new role that they now are given and trained to do, they might not want to do that, right? That's the part that people don't often talk about. And I think journalists are going to have to maybe reckon with that to some extent. I think there is a role for public interest journalism because, ironically, of the sort of AI slop and the kind of huge like tornado of content, which people, even the most sort of radicalized person is starting to realize is not in their best interest. So weirdly, we are going to benefit from how bad it has gotten, right? I think journalists sort of survive or thrive. Like when you think about 2016 and sort of subs going up because people thought the world was on fire, I think we are kind of maybe going to benefit from that. But I think to benefit in a kind of long-term view, I think there, of course, like that idea of trust and correct information, I think will become more valuable. I think the idea of it being created by a person to a full extent is going to be tough to navigate. And I think newsrooms especially are going to have to figure out like how do they like use the same amount of people, or hopefully more people, like actual human bodies, to then make a product that's much better than the AI slop that we're dealing with. Because I think the instinct of some newsrooms, and this isn't like out of malice, it's just because out of economics, but they are kind of like, and some of them have come to me sort of off the record and gone, okay, we need to fire 3 people. How do we use AI to do that? Right. And I think, and not just because it's not a nice thing to do, I would strongly recommend like that is not how you're going to win this. Because if you create the same piece of content today with half the amount of staff, in 2 years' time or 1 year's time, your content will be worth less, because the sort of ability for people to create more content with AI and the amount of content that's going to be around is you're going to need those people to make yourself stand out. So I think it's a tough game in terms of trying to upskill people. I think that's key. And I think on the other hand, the thing I think about is this sense of ego around the media. And, I am guilty of that, like a lot of people. I'm not precluding myself. But when you look at, certain startups, not so much in South Africa, but globally, like in India and other markets, who are going full tilt on personalization of content, right? So the idea that they're going, okay, you're a journalist, you're going to produce a story and you're going to submit it, and no one will read that. No one's reading what you write. No one knows who you are. But it'll get processed, and then the audience will receive it in a way that they want. Like maybe as a podcast, maybe as Twitter. And I feel that is where business models are sending newsrooms, right? To kind of personalize things. And I think that will have two horrible effects. First of all, it will ruin the idea of a common idea of what the news is, which totally obliterates activism. Like in terms of, and even if activism, I mean just deciding not to buy something, right? Or deciding not to go somewhere. Like even that collective idea of what you should do with the news will disintegrate, and that's bad for all sort of impact. And the other side is like what that will do to who a journalist is if they are just submitting to a database a list of facts. Like, will they be willing to put in the extra time? Will they do all those things that make a journalist kind of go the extra mile? I think that's more the sort of ego side of it. So it's not just about identifying skills and upskilling people. It's also kind of like nourishing certain people in ways that in a job that they might actually want to do. And I think that's definitely something that people, when they talk about surviving, they're not approaching that side of it.
I mean, that's interesting, and you made me think about a point you made, is that this might actually also change the self identity of a journalist, how they think about themselves. As you say, this idea of speaking to the public might take on a very different shape, and it will change how people think about themselves in their role, in their profession as a journalist.
Yeah, I mean, we've all been at award shows. There are going to be sad affairs in the future where no one has a byline, and like what that looks like. And I guess, I mean, not that it matters, and you might end up with better, less ego-driven people. But I think the negative side of it is that when you think of investigative journalists that put in like a whole weekend or evenings, like, they do that for certain reasons. Part of it is to make the world a better place. And part of it is because they feel they want to be part of that. And I think the job, like sort of disruption of AI, people are very much trying to just think about bare minimum, right? They're just like, oh, well, as long as you'll have a job, as long as you'll be okay, And I think, but while then you've got the sort of Elon Musks who are saying everyone will work on high thinking, everyone will be rich because they'll have perfect healthcare. And I think, I mean, I don't think that will be true, or it might be true after all the wars that it causes. But I think like we also need to kind of think as media companies, like, to try and get out of that survival mode, because we have kind of been in that since like the beginning of Facebook, right? Like people have been sort of taught that they should be grateful for their jobs. And what I'm seeing now with sort of AI is like, we're just going to double down on that as a sort of narrative. And I think, I think there is, and it's hard to break people out of that, but I think, a good way to kind of think about it is sort of the sort of old ideas of like, connecting with, I mean, Sipho will talk, he has an incredibly engaged audience that is very loyal. And I think that resource is incredibly powerful, especially if where you are finding your audience, for example, say a website disintegrates, then you need your audience to know who you are and they need to like you because you need to be able to take them with you, essentially, wherever that might be.
Sipho, I mean, let's turn to you around the issue of AI. I mean, does the continent use AI in its production process at the moment?
This is the source of intense internal conversations all the time. And I like Paul mentioned the Ponderland Observer Times. And our thinking is the same, where first you just need to experiment and play a lot. So in the background, we're all testing, playing, seeing what we can use. There's lots of things you can do with your archive and internal resources, right? But we don't use it for editorial. That's our line. And I think one of the questions, someone just put a question now about, they wrote an article and they sent it to a newsroom, and the newsroom used an AI to edit it and introduce errors. And that's that keeps propping up, and that keeps stopping us allowing AI near our stories, because you just cannot trust what comes out. And Paul touched on it. This is an issue we all talk about, is trust. Like, at the end of the day, our industry's transactional our credit is trust. Like, people come to you to know what's happening in the world and know that that's real. And if we get rid of that, then there's no business model or anything else. So no, at the moment, we're not using for editorial, which isn't to say reporters don't use AI, right? And there's many, people writing in different languages, using Translate, using Grammarly, all these different tools. So it is a reality of the industry, is it helps writers do better writing. So our job is to work out if what they're writing, they went to the place and spoke to the people, essentially.
I was going to exactly that point, as I was wondering whether, you work with reporters all across Africa, and I've certainly seen in other editorial processes that people, you can tell that they're using AI in some ways. There's certain giveaways in the text, that my favorite is the M dash, the long American dash, which suddenly is appearing in all these texts all over the place. I was wondering to what extent you have a sense that people are using AI in the work they're submitting to you. Can you pick it up at all?
I'm furious that AI has ruined the M dash, because it is my favorite of all writing tools. I hate it. It is really hard for us. So the content's been around for nearly 6 years, and we've worked with 400 different reporters. Now, a lot of those people are working in second or third language. So they're using a translator, and they're using something to improve their copy.
Yeah.
And that's fair, right? Because it creates an even playing field. When ChatGPT came along, what we doubled down on is just the relationship with the writers. Like, you have to know people, work with them, and build that trust. And that's really hard now, given that journalism is based on freelancers and accepting pitches. So we accept, we're very, very cautious about unsolicited pitches. And then we build that relationship. We test the writer. We test the human who's doing the work. It's old school in that way.
Yeah. That's a point Paul makes in his article is around you're talking about the strength of the relationships with your contributors as a way to mitigate the negative sides of AI, right? There's some positive sides, as you say, translation, that's a very clear side. But also around the writer's relationship with writing. So, what a journalist does is write. Ideally, they don't just hack information, but that relationship, their own relationship with writing, develops over time. And if AI comes in too early and is used too frequently, there's a chance that relationship won't have a time to develop. In other words, that won't in the long run produce excellent journalists who can write in their own voices about issues. Do you have a sense of that at all?
So we've had this exact conversation about editing, because you can use a ChatGPT to edit an article really fast in your publication's tone, right? And then check it for errors. And lots of places do that. We stayed away from that because editing is such an important skill. And that being able to work with stories, work with copy, work with different writers' voices and keep their voices, you just need to work it and do it over hundreds and thousands of hours. And for us, that was an internal decision. Like, your news editor needs to work on stories, because one day when they become something else, they will have had that background. And our best stories, to your point, you get a very real sense that a human being went to that border post or that town and picked up all the little details. And then you take and then you have photos that also take you to the place. And that you only develop by writing and just testing and feeling it. And I think Paul touched on this earlier, the sense of joy as well. Like, for writers, if you write a really good piece, you obviously are never happy because you're like, it could have been better. But you feel it. You're like, oh, I nailed it. I did a great job. And we need to keep that. Because there are so few things in journalism that are nice anymore. Like as workers, this is a horrible industry in so many ways. We need to, when we're thinking about do we use AI, we need to think about those kind of calculations as well.
Very interesting. And as you say, there's certain descriptive ways of describing when you're present in a situation that AI cannot describe and cannot, produce in an article. How many subscribers does the Continent have at the moment, Sipho?
So we've got 33,000 across the world, and we just reached the threshold of having one in every single African country.
Right. Okay, brilliant. Well, congratulations. That sounds really amazing. And I think it is a very nice, a very good publication. Your colleague, Simon Allison, made some contributions around funding, different contributions, but one was around the funding situation in Africa and in South Africa, which is another theme of this year's State of the Newsroom. He spoke about an inequity in how independent media gets funded. And he was saying newsrooms in South Africa or in Africa, if you have really good ideas compared to those in developed countries, they have to, and this is a quote, try to make it work on peanuts. So what is your sense of that perspective? I mean, is there a crisis in funding for African media initiatives in Africa at the moment?
Yes, because there's essentially no funding, right? And it's slightly better in Anglophone Africa, but if you go to Francophone Africa, there's nothing, right? That's a whole ecosystem unto itself. In the report, in Khadija's section, she cites research about between 2018 and 2021 or 2023, she says the $1 billion that they can work out went to journalism. And of that, 3% went to Africa. Now, only 0.5% went to Asia. So it's unfair towards everyone, but it's peanuts. And if you look at the Digital News Transformation Fund in South Africa, really good initiative, it's peanuts. Like in the big scheme of things, this is big tech spending, rounding errors on journalism, which is really hard to then scale industries or scale an idea. So you've got lots of newsrooms that have ideas, and we speak to so many journalists who've created a thing, and it's innovative, it has a community, but you just can't get it to the next level. You're just surviving all the time. And we have so many great ideas, like in South Africa, on the continent, because we're used to scarcity. Like many of the world's problems have already been solved by Africans. It's just they don't have the money to scale them or test them or get a tech stack or a developer who can help them with the next bet.
I mean, certainly from my perspective, there are known publications, small startup, kind of call them startups or independent publications, the Continent. I mean, you've got the longest standing ones, Becky Cisa. I mean, there's several working around. Do you have a sense that, I mean, it sounds like there's a bit of a startup culture on media initiatives that exists. I mean, is this quite widespread, and you clearly are part of it? I mean, you say you speak to people with ideas. Is there a lot of creativity bubbling around, people trying to get projects off the ground?
It is the upside of the total collapse of journalism, right? Our institutions, our newsrooms, our big organizations are all basically dead, and AI will finish that for the website-based newsrooms. But all of those people love journalism and storytelling in different ways, and they care about the public interest. So they're all hustling. They're all creating some sort of journalism, either by one person or banding together and doing a couple of things, which means we're going to solve this, like whatever this is, like for radio, for audio, for TV, for print. We will save journalism in whatever format. which is hopeful. It'll just be really horrible getting there.
Paul, if I could come back to the funding issue with you. I mean, you run Develop AI, and I presume some of your work is done with funding. What is your take on the funding environment at the moment? The territory you work in, South Africa, Africa, if some of your projects are there. I mean, Sipho just said that the DTNF fund is it's important, but it's quite small in effect. I mean, what is your sense of the funding environment for media projects in South Africa or Africa at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, it is, and also it's in stark contrast to, like, I do a lot of work in Eastern Europe as well, and that side of the world, and there is definitely more funding on that side of the world. Not that they would say it's a lot, and it's still not a lot, but yeah, it definitely feels like Africa is being shut out of, like, maybe what was a bit of a heyday in the sort of open society years, a little bit. And we didn't know it was a heyday at the time, but it definitely kind of feels like that now, I think. Yeah, of course, like fund and US aid, absolutely decimated so much stuff, like pulling out of that, and Voice of America. And, that was, I was kind of trying to remember when that was. And it actually was just earlier this year that happened. And then sort of knock-on effects of that, even if you weren't directly funded by that, there is now, the same amount of newsrooms all trying to vie for less money, right? Like globally. And, I think the old idea that everyone tells you when I used to do fundraising is like, you need to be on a path to sustainability. And I think especially with the US aid thing was that, yes, people can keep saying that, but if they keep giving you the money, then you're not that incentivized to be on a path to sustainability, right? Because it's working. Like Mia from Bexisa always says that, like, sure, but being donor funded, if you do it well and you're catering to your donors and your audience, is a business model. Like this idea that you're, and I think that's the first time it was a few years ago, but it's the first time I'd ever heard anyone actually admit that like everyone is sort of pretending that this money is just a gift. But like it is a real business model that you can run a newsroom entirely donor funded. And if you do it right and everything works, then that is just as much effort and just as valid as if you've got subscribers, And I think, but then, these big whales can be removed, and then everyone goes bankrupt, and then everyone goes back to like, okay, but how do we become sustainable? And I think when I think about it, especially with AI, there is initially, I think, say before AI, before this sort of deluge of content, there was a problem with scarcity, right? So you pay for something when something is scarce, right? In that standard way. And if you are a kind of person who just wants some content has not been scarce for, like, if you've got an internet connection for like 2 decades, So I think then that becomes a difficult case to go like, you should pay for this, right? And then I think AI, on its surface makes that problem harder. But I think, I do think that like there is valid work in collaboration, right? Especially when it comes to funding. And I sit in a lot of these sort of meetings with media development companies where we talk about collaboration. And, if any big company is funding a whole bunch of smaller newsrooms, they want everyone to collaborate, right? But the incentive for people to collaborate, maybe people can talk better to this, but like it's very rare that I can kind of see a newsroom that's like, we should collaborate with all these other people that a donor has just thrown together, because they don't see the reason. Like, either they're in direct competition or they're not in competition, but there is a sort of a sense of like, okay, but what are we going to really offer? Unless there is a sort of clear idea of like, you're a big platform, like a News 24, like I'm a small 2-person newsroom and I need my content to get exposure to appease my donor, for example. And that makes sense, and we're all used to that as a sort of collaborative partner. But I think, finding those points of collaboration has always been difficult. And I think the one sort of saving grace of the sort of AI tech, like product prototyping side of things, is, in my experience, it's clearer for people why they should collaborate, because it takes so much money and effort.
Mm.
And also it feels non-threatening to a lot of newsrooms. They're like, oh yeah, okay, we can collaborate over building a tool, like, because they don't feel that that's in any way, even collaborating on an investigation, right? As much as people, you know, are into that idea, who wins that has always been dispute. Like if you're the bigger newsroom or the smaller newsroom, but the idea that you're collaborating on an AI product that you'll both use behind the scenes, suddenly I'm seeing like people genuinely good with that. And I think, you know, on the funding side, like that's a huge saving. That's a huge resource that you can save around that. So that's a silver lining, I think, in this a little bit.
I mean, that's interesting because in different ways, you've spoken about this being advocacy being needed, certainly in taking on the big tech organizations, but also this is an opportunity for people who want to see the media work in a different way to sort of use this change that's going to happen around AI to advocate a bit for generally a better journalism. I mean, one that comes to mind, a practical one, is the sort of link up with smaller newsrooms and mainstream newsrooms situated in Johannesburg, and that so that more local grassroots news starts to get reported on properly in the mainstream. I mean, that's my sort of one of my pet kind of issues. But this does seem like if there's a reconstruction of the news, how the news gets made, one can sort of add different layers to this reconstruction and hopefully produce a better journalism, a more responsive media ecosystem in the end. Do you think of it like that, or more practically? Are you sort of thinking
on a good day? Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, I mean, I think like, you know, the sort of elephant in the room is the sort of the SABC in this, right? Because we talk about these things often like around small media and then community media and things like that. But I think like I've done some trainings at the SABC, and there's like, you know, like there's real want to kind of use AI, use tech, like use these things to try and like solve some of those problems within the SABC, and their sort of financial constraints, all that stuff. I think like an organization like that could really benefit from, you know, like severe, not retrenchments. I mean, severe like vitalizing of certain processes, you know, and I think you know, getting that done is another story. So I think, you know, often when you think about these things, it depends on the situation in terms of if you're thinking it's going to like cost people jobs or turn like a 3-person team into feeling like there's 20 people. But I think, you know, at the center of sort of South African media is like, if we manage to fix a lot of the SABC's sort of issues around certain things, and you know, and there's a lot of tech processes that could do that. Like we were busy talking to them about how they digitized all their archives, right? So a few years ago, they digitized all their archives. And the guy who was in charge of that wasn't there. And there was a sort of process of that, but there was a sort of metadata issue with that. So now when I spoke to someone there, they were saying that it's not searchable, right? So their archive is digitized, but it's not searchable in any way. And you're kind of like, that means you can't license that content, so you can't make revenue from it, you can't search it. So you've got like, you know, you've got a room full of hard drives that have, you know, the history of South Africa on it, and you can't get into it. You can't find it. You can't find anything. So that's like I know that's not really your question, but I guess it's kind of this thing where you're like, that's an AI process where you could like imbue that with metadata, and you'd unlock capital for the SABC. You'd make it so they could also produce their own documentaries about all the stuff that's on these hard drives. And I think, you know, when you start to think about it, like the whole like media system, it starts to like sort of fry my brain a little bit. But when you go like, okay, there are problems. Every organization has 5 to 10 problems that they might be able to solve with some of these technologies. And when you start to break that down and then start thinking like pretty much like every organization's going to have 2 or 3 of these, the shared problems is like stark. If you're producing entertainment news or politics in a different language or anything, the problems that are kind of affecting you as a newsroom are probably quite similar. And I think there is positivity in that, in kind of narrowing it down. And also still always keeping an eye on the audience side of things, because I kind of also worry that especially not really like bigger, like people that own companies, but like sort of editors are getting deep into the trenches of like trying to figure out AI and processes, and they're going to look up in 2 years and just like kind of they should have been looking further afield. So I know I keep saying that, but I think that's also an important thing for everyone to think about.
There's a question there from on the Q&A from Franz Kruger around AI shaping the news discovery. He calls it creating personalized feeds of information based on what AI thinks you'll be interested in. This goes back to the earlier question around consumption. I mean, I think, and perhaps Sipho, you've also got a perspective on that. But Paul, first, just to sort of, I suppose, revisit that idea of are we looking at? I mean, it goes to the idea of a public. Are we no longer looking at a public in terms of news consumption? Are we looking at simply individuals consuming very private news?
Yeah, I think I mean, personally, I just think it's terrible, but it's hard to argue with the business case for it, right? Like more personalized your content, the more engaged you will be. So when I speak to people about this, usually you can guess where they are in the food chain of their organization, because if they're very okay with it, you're like, oh, you haven't written an article for quite a long time. I don't think you feel okay with this. But I think, yeah, the personalized side of things, I think is bad. I think it's really bad. But like, when not to be too pious about it, because this has been around since the first time most read articles appeared on, like, I think the BBC like put that as a little box on their website, what, like 15 years ago, and then you're getting like all the top major stories, and then the most read are like usually like a couple of celebrity stories and a YouTube video, back then. So I think it's not like we have just invented this and now this is the end of everything. We have also survived with that ticking along in the background, and people have still consumed the top stories. So I don't want to be too much of a naysayer about it, but I think the proclivity for people to go into their echo chambers, and now we're going to almost encourage them to do that. Like if you look at like the Times of India, they're also like going deep into that. And I understand their idea. They're going like, well, you're going to Google News, like the sort of Android basic app, like, and you're getting just all this, the basic stuff that is kind of being pulled from your email and things like that. We're just giving you some stories. Why don't you just come to the Times of India and we'll do that for you with our own content? So I completely get that. Like if you're a huge organization, you're suddenly realizing that your exact competition is a news aggregator in an app that sits right next to your app. Why don't you aggregate your news with your own content? So I'm not really like telling people not to do this, but I think as a society, if you're going to try and be pious about it, I think it's bad. I think it's really a bad thing.
I mean, Sipho, it occurs to me while Paul was talking exactly on this issue is that, I mean, as I see, and correct me if I'm wrong, I see that what the content, the continent. I mean, what you're doing is you're curating African news once a week, right? You're selecting, you're curating, you're providing that as a curated product to your subscribers. Now, AI potentially, someone could, I guess, set the app and say, they could self-curate it. I mean, in a sense, the potential AI future news consuming experience might be working against what you're actually doing at the continent, which I think what you're doing is an important thing because that curation is critical. But do you have any thoughts on that?
I think when we embraced platforms, curation is one of the big things we gave up on. And it's such a strength of journalism, of a newsroom. And it's one of the reasons we created a newspaper. Like we went with that single weekly product, as it were. And we're currently running an advertising campaign in the newspaper which says, read from the same page. Because it is one of the fantastic things about a newspaper is all the things you didn't think you wanted to know. Like so much of the current information economy is, I need to know what I want to know, and then I'll get an agent or an algorithm to give me that. There is so much value in someone else with skills being like, oh, I guess you didn't know that, in Kenya, people are recycling Western clothes to create cassettes to create bags. Like I would have never searched for that, or the politics of why a country doesn't have fuel, right? And going to the audience in our annual surveys, so we run these big surveys, people really, really love that. The sense of, you decide, you're telling me what's important. I don't have to think about that. That decision is rested with someone else. And I'll learn things that I never knew about. That's incredibly valuable. And I think journalism, as we're trying to move past websites and SEO and all of those things, there's a moment for us to go back to that and be like, we're professionals. We're obsessed about the news and what the world is doing. Trust us to go find that and then give you it in a daily format or whatever the format is. And there's real opportunity there. And maybe even business models. Like to Paul's point, going the other way works now. Like you'll get traffic, you'll get clicks, you'll get Google ads and those things. But you're competing with tech companies who will destroy you. So you'll lose that anyway.
Yeah. I mean, that's fascinating for me because often it's about the sort of the integrity of the journalist. There's a lot of emphasis on the journalist, rightly so. But you're also moving into the editorial level. There's a lot to be said about, of course, the editorial process, but those same ideas need to be applied to the overall editorial approach of publications. Uh, Sipho, the future. Are you concerned? Are you confident? What is your general sense?
It depends on the minute of the day. I think we're nowhere near concerned enough about this moment and how AI is owned by very powerful people, men and companies that have a different incentive structure to us. And we're going into that world thinking that we can somehow shape it when we probably can't. We're not concerned enough about losing, like information integrity vanishing, because the people who make the most money in this world benefit from that power dynamic. And most journalism is going to die in this decade, right? This moment is, we started in 2007, let's say, with the collapse of journalism. It's accelerating. It is going to be traumatic and catastrophic. However, there are journalists and news leaders across the entire world who this is all we think about all day, every day. We're obsessed about this. And we will solve it, maybe in pockets, maybe in silos, and then scale that. Because too many people need information. Like it is too valuable a resource for us not to supply it and for there to be a business model there.
I mean, you talk about in quite stark terms. I mean, catastrophic. The future. I mean, I didn't ask you that question. Do you see more job losses in the main? I presume in the mainstream media that would happen. I mean, is that your kind of prediction of the future?
I mean, I think this exact report last year where Wits talked about just how many jobs have been lost in South Africa alone.
Yeah.
And you scale that by most African countries that have far fewer resources. There just aren't jobs. Like journalism is no longer an employer in most countries, outside maybe the state broadcaster and some newspapers owned by political elites. Like the death has already happened of this as a working profession. That'll get worse.
Yeah. Paul, your take on the future? Concerned, confident?
I feel like I've got to be positive now as a kind of balance. No, but okay. Like I totally agree. And the idea of a profession, I guess, I think for all of us is hard to deal with, right? And this idea that it's not going to change, but maybe vanish. But I do take some sort of encouragement with and this isn't really journalism as such. In fact, it's almost like the sort of like counter to it. But when I was in Kenya when they were essentially trying to topple the government on TikTok, right? And I was giving trainings to like big media houses in Kenya at the time. And they were complaining that, yeah, they just can't keep up. They're basically reporting on what is happening, right? They're not making the activism, if you like. They're not making the change in that society. They were just reporting on it. And they were disputing about like the number of people that had died during the protests, like, this kind of thing. And it was discouraging for journalism as a profession in this idea that like this is something that's, arguably changing the country, but it's not being led by the media, right? We're maybe in a different generation and it is media in a sense that it's social media and it's like, people are communicating to the public directly, but it wasn't being done by like media houses, right? And I think on the one hand, that's quite scary. I think if you're over a certain age and you think like the kids just can do whatever they want. But I think there's also, I was quite encouraged by it. I quite liked the sort of anarchy idea of this idea that people are all coalescing over this idea of essentially one of the tenets is like anti-corruption. And they're like exposing them on TikTok and things like that. But it really made me realize that like, if you're a big organization and you're just following these guys around and reporting on them and getting caught up in the details of how you're reporting on that, you're not changing the world. You're not adding the value that, historically we kind of tell ourselves that we're adding as journalists, right? Like that's being done by these other people that wouldn't consider them, definitely would never call themselves journalists and definitely don't have a media organization. So, my positive side is the kids are going to be all right if they keep doing stuff like that. But I would say that like, it's probably, and this like Sipho's point is going to be quite uncomfortable for everyone. But the idea of, it made me think that like the people that are doing something like that, if they were like trained and kind of better at it or kind of given maybe better ethics or some kind of guidance to that kind of instinct or incentive that people are wanting to do that, which is great. Exposing corrupt politicians is a great thing. But the idea that it's sort of just left in this haphazard way is quite scary to me. But it kind of feels like the energy of journalism, the imbued with, combined with that would be very powerful. But that is like a different industry, right? That's almost like educated activism, or I don't know what it is, but it's definitely not journalism as we understand it at the moment.
Yeah, and I understand that some universities, journalism schools are starting to consider training influencers or courses for influencers and so on, which seems like a very good thing. And so UNESCO, I think, is also doing that kind of work. I would like to thank you both for joining us and being on the panel for this. Paul and Sipho, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating conversation. We haven't quite reached the end of the hour, but I think we can end here. I'm sorry that some of our guests couldn't join us today. I think the link has been put into the chat for you to download. And again, I would like to thank Paul and Sipho for joining us, as well as Wild Tiger, who laid out the edition of State of the Newsroom, and Leslie Cowling, who proofread the edition. With that, we hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you very much. Goodbye.